Tomatoes are one of my absolute favourite things to grow. In fact, some gardeners get into gardening just for the pure pleasure of growing their own tomatoes. You could struggle coming across a greenhouse or a polytunnel anywhere that hasn't got a tomato plant growing in it. They're a very popular thing to grow, and for good reason. Growing your own tomatoes tastes so much better than the ones which you would buy in the supermarket. I found that the ones in the supermarket taste like water for a start. They don't taste anywhere near as good as the ones that you've grown yourself. And there's something so incredibly satisfying about growing your own tomatoes at home. I just love watching them yellow flowers fall off and that little pinprick grow into a bigger green fruit, which then eventually turns red in time. Now, when it comes to growing tomatoes, there's plenty of information out there to know about growing them, and there's plenty of different methods and techniques that gardeners have learned over the years and passed down over generations. But I've got 9 tips which I'm going to be giving you in today's video, things that I've learned over the years growing tomatoes, and the hope that I can help some of you with growing your tomatoes as well. But before we get into the video, I would just like to say that hitting that like button if you like the video really helps out a lot. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you can see when it uploads new content just like this. Whoa! Okay. So tip number 1, when you're training your tomato plants vertically to make the most use of the space that you have, you want to prune off the side shoots that appear between the leaf and the stem of the plant, which is called the armpit by some gardeners. So you want to take these off, and what that will do is it will train the plant vertically rather than bushy, which it would do naturally, and this will make it a much neater plant, and it will also reduce the risk of pests and diseases as well, because you'll have much better aeration and ventilation, and everything's just going to be much neater and much tidier. If I were to let all these tomato plants, if I were to let all their suckers, as they're called, I would end up with a massive jungle of tomato plants, and I'd probably end up with a big problem with late blight as well. But you don't really need to do this with determinate varieties of tomato. If you were to prune the side shoots off your determinate varieties, then you're not really going to end up with any fruit, because these side shoots actually will produce our flowers and fruit. So determinate varieties, you want them to be bushy, so you don't want to prune them side shoots off. There aren't that many determinate varieties out there, but it will usually already be stated on the packet of seeds. A couple of varieties which I can think of are Tiny Tim and Roma, just to name a few. So tip number 2, when your tomato plants have 5 trusses of tomatoes on them, take the top of the tomato plant, take the tip of it off so it can't grow any taller. You want the plant to focus its energy on ripening the fruits that it already has than 5 trusses. You don't want it to end up trying to produce more fruits on the top, because it'll take the energy out of the fruits below it, and you want the plant to focus on ripening them fruits. If your plant gets any taller and tries to produce fruit when it's quite late in the season, then fruits probably aren't going to have time to ripen anyway. So I like to keep it at 5 trusses and no more than that really. Otherwise you're going to end up trying to ripen tomatoes in November. Tip number 3, when you transplant your tomato plants, plant them as deep as you possibly can. Take off the first few leaves on the bottom of the plant, and I like to plant the tomato plant up to half of its depth. And what will happen is, up the stem which you have buried, roots will form, and that will help produce a much stronger root system. So if your plant is 12 inches tall, I will take off the first couple of leaves at the bottom up to the first 6 inches, and I will bury the plant 6 inches deep, and that will give us some really good results and help us produce a better root system. Tip number 4, when your tomato plants leaves start to go yellow at the bottom and die off, which is normal by the way. When leaves are old, they will start to die off because them leaves are useless now. And there's no point leaving them on there either. Once they start to rot away, they're not going to give the plant any more energy. They're not going to do anything for the plant. So you may as well just cut these off. And what that will do is it will better help with aeration, and it will also reduce the risk of diseases as well. You don't want bits of rotten leaves falling around everywhere. It's just no good really. So what I will do around July, August time, when I've got a good few trusses of fruit on my tomato plants, is I will actually cut off a good amount of leaves on the bottom half of my tomato plants, up to halfway up the plant actually. And this may seem dramatic at first, but actually it will help ripen our fruits better, help with ventilation, which is really important towards the later half of the summer because, you know, late tomato blight is rife, especially for us. We have a really big problem with it. So you want aeration and ventilation to be really good around your tomato plants. So cutting off the lower leaves of your tomato plants later on in the season is my tip number 4. Tip number 5, when you transplant your tomato plants into their final positions, whether it be a pot or a raised bed like this, I like to remove the flowers that appear 2 weeks after I've transplanted them. I don't like to leave any buds, flowers or anything like that on for at least 2 weeks because I want my tomato plants to become established in their new home. There's no point the tomato plant trying to produce fruit when the root system hasn't even established and become stronger yet. There's no point doing that. These tomato plants here have been in here now for a little over 2 weeks, and which is fine because there are a few buds starting to appear now, and I will leave them on there. Any that appeared a week or two ago, I picked those off. So the plant can focus on establishing and growing a stronger root system instead. Tip number 6, when your tomato flowers appear, you're probably going to have to help them with pollination, especially if you're growing them in a greenhouse or a polytunnel like this. Bees can have a hard time getting in and out of greenhouses for a start anyway for pollination, and the numbers are declining as it is. So what I like to do with my tomato flowers, I just give them a good tap just to release some of that pollen. Now, tomatoes are mostly self-pollinating anyway, so you don't really need to start transferring between different plants. Just give them flowers a bit of a tap or a bit of a jiggle, and that'll release some of the pollen from the flower, and that will pollinate the flower so we can get some tomatoes. And an electric toothbrush also works great with this as well, but I just like to use my hand, to be honest, you know, because I want to use my toothbrush for brushing my teeth. But yeah, that works well as well if you've got an old toothbrush. If you don't have flowers that are pollinated properly, then you end up with different problems. Tip number 7, apply a mulch around your tomato plants. This could be grass clippings, wood chip, straw, partly composted material, can be many different things. So mulch will help prevent moisture loss through evaporation, which will greatly reduce the risk of blossom end rot, which is a big problem with tomatoes if there is not enough consistent watering. Blossom end rot is caused by a lack of calcium, but that it is actually caused by the plant's inability to access calcium in the soil because of inconsistent watering. Because what happens is when watering isn't consistent enough and the soil dries out too much, the roots of the tomato plant actually start to die off. So the plant is unable to access calcium as effectively in the soil because its roots are dying off. So by keeping the soil level more consistent with moisture, by applying a mulch, which massively helps, you are going to reduce the risk of blossom end rot. It's a common misconception amongst many gardeners that calcium is the main cause, and it's not actually the direct cause, it's actually inconsistent watering. So no matter how much calcium you add to it, Epsom salts, eggshells, you're still going to end up with the blossom end rot problem if you're not going to keep on top of your watering. And another great thing that mulch is going to do as well, actually it'll do a few more things. It will also reduce the risk of disease again, because when you're applying a mulch to the soil and you're watering around your plants, you've not got that bare soil beneath it, which is going to be splashing up bits of soil onto the stem. So it's going to be much cleaner. You're not going to have any soil splashback when you're watering. So you're reducing the risk of disease a lot there, because there's no bacteria splashing back up onto the plant. So this is going to create an environment which is less preferred by tomato blight. So tip number 8, I know I said it before with ventilation with the leaves and things like that, but ventilation is really, really important. If you're growing your tomatoes in a greenhouse or a polytunnel, having your vents open, having your doors open, especially during hot weather, is really important. Not only for reducing the risk of disease like late blight or early blight even, but also reducing the risk of plant stress as well, which can cause many problems actually. If the temperature in your greenhouse goes too high, usually 30 degrees or above, your plants can become stressed. Tomato plants start to become stressed when temperatures go above 30 degrees for prolonged periods of time, and this can cause curling of your tomato leaves. Obviously it can cause wilting because they're going to be drying out. It can also cause dry set, where your tomatoes don't seem to be producing any fruit. You just get little tiny pinprick tomatoes and nothing else when the flowers fall off. You can also get blossom drop as well, where the tomato just abandons its flowers and just drops them on the floor. You don't get any tomatoes. You can also have problems with greenback as well because of the high temperatures. You can also even have problems with poor pollination, because when your greenhouse becomes too hot and too humid, you can actually have the pollen stick together inside the flower, so pollination can't take place quite as well. So there are many different problems. There are actually more than this, but that's just a few. So good ventilation during hot weather is crucial for success with tomatoes. So I have to stress that again, and I can't stress that enough. Good ventilation in your greenhouse. And number 9, food. You must feed your tomato plants enough if you want to get a good harvest. Tomato plants are quite needy plants. When you're growing a lot of them together like this, for example, a load in a raised bed, they're going to be taking a heck of a lot of nutrients out of the soil. And in the wild, tomato plants aren't going to grow like this, this growing method, which is obviously to get the most out of a small space. And it's just not going to grow like that in the wild. So because they're not in the natural habitat, and they're not growing as they would naturally, we are going to have to give them a bit of a boost. We're going to have to give them the food and the nutrients in order to get a good harvest. Now, there are things which we'll add before we plant them, and that's, compost. There are many different things. Bloodfish and bone meal is a really good one. Well-rotted manures, things like that. There are many different things which you can add before planting. But there are also things you're going to have to do throughout the growing time as well when they're growing. Applying a liquid seaweed feed like Tomerite, for example, is going to be beneficial for us. I like to do that Once a week, when the first flowers start to appear, I will apply a liquid seaweed feed every week. I may also top dress with a little bit of bone meal as well, every 2 or 3 weeks in between as well, and because bone meal is a really good one for fruit development. You know, it's got that potassium and phosphorus in there, and it'll also help the roots grow as well. It's really good for root development. So yeah, giving your plants feed throughout the growing season is really important as well if you want success. So that was 9 tips of growing tomatoes, which I would like to share with you today. So I hope I've managed to provide some useful information to you all today. There are many different things to know about tomatoes. You know, there's way more information than what I've just given you, but that is just some of it that I'd like to share with you today. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Remember, if you like the video, smash that like button because it really helps out a lot. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you can see when I upload new content just like this. So I hope to see you in the next video. I hope you all stay safe and happy gardening.